Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to talk about the RAD supplemental notice. All of you are critical to the continuing success of the RAD program, and we've been really impressed and pleased by the work that you've done so far. I'm Tom Davis. I'm the director of the Office of Recapitalization. And the recap team has been working on the RAD supplemental notice to create some changes that we think continue to improve the program. It's been a little while coming, but we're pleased to be able to have released it and to be implementing it now. We've got a lot of cool stuff in the RAD notice. Some changes to align with administration priorities on energy efficiency and climate, resident engagement and equity, things to make the admissions and rent setting process fairer for certain residents, things to make the budgets for PRAC conversions and public housing conversions stronger, to ease the challenges of implementing RAD and Section 18 blends, and to promote the potential of our Fair Cloth to RAD initiative to bring new rental assistance units online to restore some that have been lost over the last couple decades. There's a whole lot more in the RAD notice. We're glad you're here. And we're going to dig into the details over the next almost 2 hours. So with that, welcome. Glad you've joined us. And I am going to turn the microphone over to various members of the Office of Recap team, starting with Ashwin Warrior. Ashwin.
Great, thanks, Tom. And good afternoon, everybody. As Tom mentioned, my name is Ashwin Warrior. I'm a recapitalization program specialist here in the Office of Recap. I want to start just by welcoming you all warmly to this training on the recently announced supplement to the RAD notice. Before we dive in, I want to go over just a few quick housekeeping reminders. First, I want to remind everybody to mute their line and keep it muted throughout the presentation. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end where we can pull people off mute to ask a question. But during the presentation, we're hoping that if you have questions, drop them into the chat. We'll try and answer as many as we can as we go section by section. But as I mentioned, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation where you'll be able to ask us questions directly if we don't get to them. We will be recording this session. It is already starting to be recorded, and we'll make the recording available after the call, along with a PDF version of the slides we present today. It'll also be sent out to anyone who registered and also be made available on HUD.gov/RAD, as well as the RAD resource desk. It may take maybe a day or two before we get the video out. However, we just gotta process it. Today, we'll be going through all the changes in the RAD supplemental notice and explaining what they mean for you as owners of 202 properties, as public housing authorities, or as residents at a property undergoing a RAD conversion. I'm joined on the line today by Will Levy, Director of Program Administration in the Office of Recap, as well as a number of my wonderful Recap colleagues who may jump in to answer questions and provide some additional context as necessary. But Will and I are going to be sort of tag teaming the presentation today. So with that, let's begin. We've got a lot to cover today. Okay, I wanted to start with just a little bit of background and a clarification. Many of you probably saw the announcement last week and the press release about the release of the supplemental notice. And although we have posted the revised notice to the HUD website, it has yet to be formally published in the Federal Register. It's only once that has actually occurred that any of the changes listed in the notice can really take effect. That sort of starts the clock for us for implementation. We expect the publication to be imminent in the next weeks, but we just wanted to be clear that implementation of the notice won't begin until Federal Register publication. Once again, just a quick reminder to stay on mute throughout the presentation. Thanks, y'all. The notice won't be implemented until the publication of the Federal Register. So you may hear, as we go through the presentation today, some references to specific timings for implementation relative to that Federal Register publication. Now, many of the items we'll talk about will take effect immediately once it's published, but some may only take effect 10, 14, or even up to 30 days after that publication in the Federal Register. And we'll make clear as we go what that effective date is. And we have a summary slide at the end that covers all that information as well. We just want to make sure everyone's aware that not everything goes into effect immediately. And until the Federal Register notice is published, none of this has taken effect just quite yet. Finally, one last note, if you want to follow along with the presentation and have the notice in front of you, you can go to hud.gov/rad. You'll find under the What's New header, just right on that page, 2 documents. One is just the supplemental changes, and one is the entire RAD notice with sort of track changes so you can see what has changed, if folks wanted to have that up while we go through. Okay, let's start with a little bit of an overview of what is actually in the supplemental notice and what it all means. As I mentioned, we've got a lot to cover today, but there are really 8 key sections in the notice that have changes that are listed out here. We're going to go through all 8 of these and provide an overview of the changes along with what that actually means on the ground. You can see here we've broken those up into sections because there are some changes in the notice that only affect Section 202 PRAC conversions, specifically around the initial contract rent settings. There's a good number of changes that only affect public housing conversions. And then there's one change related to radon that affects all conversions. The last note I'll say here, you can see it at the bottom of the screen. This revision of the RAD notice doesn't include incorporation of Section 811 conversions. That will be under a separate notice revision that will come at a later date. Okay, let's start with Section 202, project rental assistance contracts. So Section 202, housing for the elderly. This is a change that is only applicable to Section 202 PRAC conversions. And those that serve elderly individuals. So when it comes to RAD for 202 PRACs, there have been sort of 2 problems that we've heard from y'all as owners that we wanted to try address in the supplemental. The first being that conversion rents are often too low to really support recapitalization. That's sort of one on the one hand. On the other hand, sometimes the rents at conversion are too high, and we've had to reduce rents for anyone who came in with a transaction over 120% of the fair market rents, which is the cap for the conversion under RAD. For those who aren't as familiar, rents can be higher in Section 202 properties because they receive a budget-based rent increase, and they also include the cost of services. So sometimes when properties are converting, they'll find that they were above that 120% FMR cap when it had to be brought under 120% FMR in order to be able to convert. With the supplemental, we're trying to address both ends of that issue, trying to find a way to be able to increase the rents for those whose rents are too low, at the same time address that issue for people who maybe came in at a little bit higher of the end of the spectrum. So let's talk a little bit more about how we're addressing both of those 2 things. First, on the rents being too high side, we are now permitted to have the post-conversion contract rents exceed 120% FMR. When the existing budget-based rent adjustment, the PRAC rents are already above 120% FMR, especially if it's would permit the property to maintain supportive services at the site. Also note that you can use the small area FMR for the calculation of the FMR limit. So this is a huge change. Hopefully it'll allow those properties that were coming in with higher budgets above 120% FMR to not have to reduce their rents. On the other side, on the rents being too low, for numbers 2 and 3 here, we have received, really for the first time ever, money from Congress to actually help increase rents at conversion. So the fiscal year 22 and 23 appropriations bills included $6 million each to improve rents at conversion for properties that are making attempts to address energy and water efficiency and improve aging in place for residents. This is a really huge deal. We know how hard it can be for any property, but particularly 202s, to make a RAD conversion work. So we're really excited to be able to deploy this funding and get it out to y'all in the field. Finally, the other way we're looking to improve 202 conversion rents is by allowing owners to increase their contract rents by 75% of utility savings where they're undertaking work that would result in a reduction in tenant paid utilities. We're going to talk a little bit more about what each of these 3 things mean. But this is sort of the main changes for 202 and the PRAC conversions. Okay, so a little bit more detail on probably the most exciting item here, which is the $12 million that's available to be able to deploy to increase the PRAC rents. The $12 million is being made available to owners on a first come, first served basis. The way that we are structuring it is that properties can get up to $250 per unit per month, addition to their contract rents, or $100 per unit per month. It depends on the amount of construction you're going to be doing and undertaking as part of the conversion. How much you're eligible for is based on the project's hard construction costs relative to HUD's measure of housing construction costs. So those of you may be familiar, the Office of Public and Indian Housing produces construction cost measures, estimating the cost of construction for areas all across the country. What we're saying is that if your hard construction costs when you're coming in with the 202 project exceed 60% of what the housing construction costs are identified for your area, you could be eligible for up to $250 per unit per month. If you exceed 30% of those construction limits, you'd be eligible for up to $100 per unit per month. One of the key things here is that the owner has to demonstrate that whatever rehab you're doing is enhancing climate resiliency, energy efficiency, water efficiency, or helping seniors age in place. You also have to demonstrate that the project wouldn't otherwise be financially feasible without this increase. One thing to note, because we did talk about the 120% cap being waived for projects that are converting through RAD and had higher rents, 120% FMR. The preservation rent increase here can only take you up to 120% of FMR. It couldn't take you above that cap. That would still be in place if you're requesting this rent increase. So you may be asking the question of how do I actually go about accessing this rent increase? Again, this is the $12 million in funding is going to be first come, first serve. You would do it by completing a request via the resource desk. So owners, you'll be able to apply separately for these funds by completing, it's called a preservation rent increase request on the resource desk. It'll ask you for required information, including a description of the scope of work you're undertaking. There'll also be a workbook available that will help you determine what level of increase you might qualify based on the construction costs you're proposing. So you wouldn't have to do that math yourself. So you'll fill out this preservation rent increase request on the resource desk. It'll be approved as part of the conversion plan. And once HUD has determined that the work you're undertaking is addressing climate and energy, aging in place, and is financially necessary to support the project, the increase will be included and approved in the closing documents. There'll be a new preservation rent increase section on the HAP term sheet that you receive. So I know we've already gotten some questions from projects that are about to close, whether they would be eligible to access this rent increase. Yes, if you haven't closed yet, you are eligible to apply for the preservation rent increase, but it will require a little bit of work with your transaction manager to amend the conversion plan and to show that the project wouldn't be viable without this funding. I mean, you'd still have to meet the construction cost limits and show that you're making changes that are addressing resiliency, efficiency, or aging in place design. Okay. One last thing I'll say here is that, again, this will all go live when the Federal Register notice is published. So if you're already racing over to the resource desk trying to input your preservation rent increase, that won't have registered just yet on the resource desk, but will be live once the Federal Register notice is published. The last thing, we will have a number of other resources available. I mentioned the workbook that will help you determine the eligibility for the different rent increases. There will also be a 202 PRAC preservation rent increase FAQ that will be published alongside. That'll go into some more detail and hopefully answer other questions that you might have there. Okay. Next, I wanted to talk about the PRAC utility savings, another big opportunity for properties to address increasing rents at their conversion. So the other major change here for 202s is allowing owners to retain 75% of the money from utility savings for tenant paid utilities. So normally as a 202 owner, if you were to make energy efficient upgrades, you wouldn't actually see any of that financial benefit, because what HUD would do is we'd reduce the utility allowance just by an equal amount of that savings. So there wasn't really an incentive to make energy efficient upgrades. What we've changed with the supplemental is that we are allowing you as owners to accrue 75% of those savings. You can see here in this example in the chart here. In this hypothetical example, before rehab, contract rents were $800 with a $200 utility allowance. Previously, if that owner was able to reduce their utility costs, we would just reduce the utility allowance and they would end up being no better off. In this case, we are now increasing their contract rents by 75% of that decrease to incentivize these types of upgrades. So in this case, if they reduce their utility costs by $100, we will add $75 to the contract rents and the post-rehab rent schedule. That's something just to note. The utility increase doesn't go in automatically. There'll be a pre and post rehab rent schedule. The rents will be applied post-rehab. The other piece here, as you can see on the screen, is that all utility projections would have to be performed by a third-party engineer to be able to project out what the post-rehab savings will be. Okay, talk a little bit more about how to request the utility savings. This request is also made as part of the conversion plan submission, so alongside the preservation rent increase. You'll need to include a narrative discussing the proposed upgrade, anticipated savings, as well as a description of the basis for what you think you will be saving. And that is also the point where you'd want to include the utility allowance projections, the ones that's provided by a third-party professional engineer. You can load up all these documents into the resource desk in our office recap. We'll review that request. We may get the question, the cost of the utility study. That third-party professional engineer, unfortunately, has to be covered by the owner. That couldn't be covered by HUD funds. But if all goes well, if it's all approved, the HAP contract term sheet will show that pre and post rehab rent schedule. Just as an aside, we'll say that this ability to be able to accrue savings from the utility reductions has been around for the public housing side of RAD for quite a while, although mostly, tenant utilities are owner paid on the public housing side. So this is a new option. We're bringing a little bit more parity for the 202 conversions, which are also tend to be more tenant paid. So we expect to hopefully see this be as a useful tool for folks who are trying to make energy efficient upgrades and to be able to reap some of the financial benefit from that. Okay, I am going to pause here just for a second before we get into resident engagement and protections to take a quick look at the chat and see if we've got any questions. Let's see, is the rent increase only for preservation 202s, or would new construction 202s be eligible as well? I believe this would just be for the preservation conversion option for RAD conversions. At what point can properties request this? Again, this is available when you're going through the conversion process, submitting it as part of the conversion overview. So it would be before closing, but while you're still working your way through the process. Stacey, do you want to add a little bit more?
Sure. For the properties that are in the planning stages of their conversion of an existing 202 prac, we're working on developing guidance on what owners can submit in order to allow HUD to issue a comfort letter, so they can use that when they're applying for financing. I saw that in one of the questions too. So we don't have specific guidance out right now, but what we're working on with the resource desk would allow owners to get a preliminary scope of work and sources and uses in the resource desk that would allow us to issue a comfort letter that would be then reviewed again once the final scope of work is determined.
And sorry, I may have misspoken. I saw Stacey, you clarified that new construction pracs can apply.
Yes.
In this case. Yep. Okay. And the last question here, maybe I'll also pass this to Stacy if you have initial thoughts. This is the one from Greg. We have a mixed transaction of rehab with a 202 prac, with new construction for LIHTC only. With the hard costs for comparison to the HCCs be rehab only or the whole project?
So typically we are looking at the whole project. So that, yeah, I see Will nodding. So we have a tool that we'll also be publishing where you can enter the construction cost. So when you're doing that preliminary determination, if you're eligible, you'd use the cost for the entire project, not just the converting units.
Great. Okay, there's some additional questions from Vince about minimum energy standard upgrades resiliency. We will be providing sort of further guidance and sort of evaluation on the exact precise amount for the rent increases. And so we may come back to that question. I believe it should be covered in our FAQs that we'll be releasing as well. And a question from Chris, if we were trying to convert without a need for financing or upgrading utilities, but our rents are currently low, can you confirm that this change will not help us? Because I'd say for the preservation rent increase, it could potentially still help you, especially if outside of utility changes or energy efficiency upgrades, you wanted to make changes that helped residents age in place. Otherwise, for the utility increase, it would really have to be something that would reduce your overall utility allowance for you to be able to see this increase to the contract rent. So it may not be the best fit for you in that situation. Okay, we'll have time for more questions at the end as we go along, and feel free to continue to drop them in the chat. But in the meantime, wanted to move on to another very important section of the supplemental notice, which is resident engagement in public housing conversions. So, excuse me, there are a number of changes. You can see some of them outlined here on the screen that the supplemental notice makes to resident engagement. We think these are a crucial, essential part of a RAD conversion, and a really important part of resident engagement and communication with residents has always been a part of the RAD conversion process. Now that we've been doing this for about a decade, we've also picked up on some best practices that we wanted to implement program-wide. You can see there's a list of different things here. These changes allow us to better monitor engagement, provide a little bit more clarity about when and how you should be engaging residents. But really, I think that the two biggest changes that may affect how you conduct conversions are, one, a change in the timing and the number of resident meetings that are required, and two, an increase in the number of items that would be required to be submitted by you as a PHA to demonstrate engagement with residents. We'll talk a little bit more about what exactly all that looks like, but I do want to note that these changes only go into effect 30 days after the Federal Register is published. So you've got a 30-day window before these things take effect. Okay, let's talk about that first piece, which is the resident meetings. On the screen, you should be able to see a graphic that shows the meeting schedule under the old notice, as well as under the supplemental. So we've got the old notice up top and the supplemental telling you the number of meetings you had to take before your RAD application, before the concept call, and before closing. One of the changes you can see here is that there is now a new required meeting after you have received your RAD conversion commitment, RCC, but before closing. So that bottom right square there in the graphic. Before we didn't require any meeting before or post RCC before closing. So overall, we've gone from really a minimum of 4 required meetings to 5, adding this one before closing. And we felt that this additional meeting was important to keep residents informed, especially before activity kicks off post-closing. So the other change here that you might see is that we've altered the timing of some of the meetings that typically take place around the concept call. So right here in the middle, we used to require 1 meeting before the concept call and 1 meeting before submitting your financing plan, which is when you come with excuse me, I'll go back. One meeting before concept call and one meeting before submitting the financing plan. What we found is that we oftentimes ran into a situation where PHA was ready to submit their financing plan right after the concept call, but then needed to hold another meeting when really nothing had changed in the Public Housing Authority's plans. They were able to move smoothly, but had to slow things down a little bit to hold a meeting that didn't provide any new information to the residents. What we've decided is to make this requirement a little bit more flexible. Now we're just requiring at least 2 meetings before the concept call takes place. So it's the same number of meetings, but a little bit more flexibility of when those meetings happen to allow you to schedule them in a way that is more productive and more informative for the residents. So those are the two changes on the resident meetings. Next, I want to talk about the other piece I mentioned, which is documentation of all this resident engagement. Because in addition to the meetings, we are requiring some additional documentation, both at the initial application stage and the financing plan stage. The graphic up here summarizes the documentation required at both of those stages. All of these items would need to be uploaded to the resource desk. Once the Federal Register notice goes live, you'll see these changes reflected in the resource desk, places to upload these items. We'll also have a separate resident engagement template, a form that will lay out everything that needs to be collected in sort of the format. We can see here, there's a lot more information that we've been asking for previously. Some things remain the same, still have to provide the resident information notice or the RIN, but we will be asking for a summary of meeting attendees, description of efforts to promote tenant participation, meeting agendas and presentation materials, summary of questions and comments, which are already required under the old notice to collect and the responses, description about residents who are unable to attend the meetings might be able to access materials, as well as materials that were shared with residents about specific protections. We'll also be asking for the contact information for an elected leader of a resident organization, if one of those exists, to be able to connect with that organization directly. All those items required in the RAD application, many of those will carry over into the financing plan. I know folks may have some questions about the exact format in which you might have to submit some of those items. That's what the resident engagement template will really help lay out. It'll be a little bit clearer on the resource desk, exactly what you need to submit for all those different pieces. But we feel like this is a really important plan just to obviously understand that a lot of you are already taking these steps and doing these things, but to make sure we have the appropriate insight and oversight to make sure that residents are duly informed and protected with their rights. Okay. So when you're reading the notice and the resident in protection engagement section, you may see some updated language on both the required and encouraged aspects of resident engagement. For example, there's more robust language, a reminder of the required compliance with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA, which specify accessibility for persons with disabilities. Be reminded that meetings have to be made accessible to those persons in the most integrated setting. And if they can't be made accessible, that other accommodations must be made so that they are duly informed of their rights and their protections. All this was still required under the old notice, but it's just a little bit more explicit in the language. So there's also items there about meaningful access to programs for individuals with limited English proficiency that can take a variety of forms, translation, language assistance, but make sure that they also have access to the notification in meetings. And finally, just a reminder that you can't restrict attendance to the meetings unless it's necessary for the effective conduct of the meetings, which, for example, might be you have a 40-person room, so you have to limit it to 40 people for fire safety reasons. So there's some language here about these types of requirements, but you may also see some encouragement, some best practices that we've seen public housing authorities across the country undertake and we think are important. Things to keep in mind and to consider. These are just some of the questions that I think we would encourage housing authorities to think through that could lead to better engagement and more equitable outcomes. Things about thinking about what time of the day and days of week days of the week that meetings are offered, how resident participation might be affected by a hybrid meeting or an electronic meeting versus an in-person meeting, making sure that you have the right people at the meetings to be able to provide timely and useful answers to residents. If there's opportunities to include resident preferences or opinions into project design by engaging them early. And then beyond what is required within the RAD process, how else are you providing regular updates and engaging residents outside of just the meetings and notices? Some great examples and some encouragement in the RAD notice that talks about those aspects of a RAD conversion. Okay, so to summarize, what does this mean for you as a public housing authority? Well, again, these changes go into effect 30 days following the publication, so it's not immediately. Second, if you're in the middle of a transaction, you should know that if your transaction has gone past a point at which those changes would apply, you would be allowed to abide by the old rules. So let's say on the meeting schedules, if you already have an RCC, you wouldn't be required to do anything different for the things related to the RAD application or the financing plan. We wouldn't ask you to go back and meet the requirements. But we would require you to go forward and meet all of the new requirements. So for example, if you have the RCC, you would still be required to hold that last meeting before closing, even though you're already in the RAD conversion process. So as I mentioned, there's updated documentation requirements. They'll be fulfilled through the resource desk. And then finally, for that last meeting, you'll be certifying that meeting between RCC, or RAD conversion commitment, and closing occurred through the consolidated owner certification. The last piece that I'll say there is for residents, and we mentioned this in the RAD notice, that residents should know that if they have any questions or concerns, that they can contact HUD directly at rad@hud.gov. We've got a fantastic resident protection and engagements team that is really ramping up and working on implementing a lot of these changes, but also connecting directly with the tenants and residents. Want to make sure that that contact information is also available to them. Okay, I am going to pause there before we get to energy efficiency and climate resilience, just to do another check on questions. Let me go up. So the resident engagement changes, yes, are just for public housing or RAD 1. Question from Bruce: can the 2 resident meetings prior to application and prior to concept call take place on the same day, or are they supposed to be spread out over weeks or months? That is a good question. I might turn it to either Will or Tayi if either of you have an immediate answer to that about the timing of those meetings, if there's specified a spacing between them.
Hey, feel free to add on. For the pre-application meetings, the content will often be very similar. So really the goal is to maximize participation, right? And if holding it the same day and 2 different times of the day means you're able to get folks who are there during, in the morning hours, and a different group of folks who are there after work hours or something like that, then that could very well make sense. For the meetings that are occurring after application and before the concept call, the goal really there is to make sure folks have, that residents have periodic updates as to the status of the conversion. And so spacing those out probably makes more sense, certainly from a best practices point of view, so that you're checking in with residents more intermittently. We also have, of course, requirements that if there are any delays from CHAP to financing plan, additional meetings might be required. So that's in the same vein of making sure that there are periodic touch points with the residents. Tayi, do you have anything to add to that?
No, nothing to add to that.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Will. Thanks, Tayi. And Lauren, I see that question about if a PHA has not yet submitted an application yet, but has begun resident meetings, is subject to notice requirements. imagine the Federal Register is published before the application is submitted. So again, we'd have the Federal Register notice being published. You'd still have 30 days before they took effect. And at that point, if it hadn't been submitted, you would still have to meet the new supplemental requirements. But again, you'd have that 30 days after the Federal Register notice is published. Say a couple of questions just around when the engagement template will be available on the resource desk. We expect to have that up with the Federal Register notice publication or shortly thereafter. Because again, this won't be taking effect until 30 days after that publication, but we're going to try and get that up as quickly as possible so you all understand what would be required of you. And I see Stacy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I was just going to add that we would expect that those will be up next week.
Great.
On the resource desk.
Awesome. Thanks, Stacy. And the last question there from Jeff is about a fair cloth to RAD timeline. It's a great question, and there is a section about resident engagement around fair cloth to RAD, but we're going to get to that in the fair cloth to RAD section. So I'll hold off on that question there, but Jeff, remind us if we don't get to it. We want to make sure we answer that question, because we did clarify how to deal with resident engagement in a fair cloth to RAD development. Okay, great. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit about energy efficiency, climate resilience, and public housing conversions. This is a big focus of the administration and across the federal government, looking at how we can make our properties both more efficient, but also protect residents from the current and future effects of climate change. That's something that we really can't ignore. And when you're undergoing a RAD conversion, it's a great opportunity to think proactively about how to address some of those issues. So those of you who are familiar with the RAD notice know that the existing notice did cover energy, water, and environmental hazards, but one thing that was missing from the notice was specific sections around climate resilience. So the new supplemental notice adds an entirely new section on climate resiliency. Really does push RAD, I think, to be one of the leading programs at HUD, requiring participants to think about these issues and address them head on. You can see here a brief summary of these changes. We'll go into more detail, but generally, this is about increasing standards for energy efficiency and making sure that properties are equipped to handle disasters and handle the fallout from climate change. So there's a number of new things that are here in the notice. Let's start with the energy efficiency, though. So the first big change is that we are updating the requirements for all new construction. I'll just say that again, this is just for new construction or projects that include a new construction component. And we are updating the requirements with the most recent IECC and ASHRAE building requirements. We were previously relying on codes from 2007 and 2009. So this is a really important update and one that just sort of brings us in line with the latest standards and codifies that in the RAD notice. We've also expanded the list of encouraged green certifications to better reflect what people are using in the latest standards in the field. For rehab and other conversions, we are just maintaining our existing requirements. So we're still requiring an energy audit, Energy Star, WaterSense, or Federal Energy Management Program designated appliances where it works. There's no real change there. It's really just the updated code requirements for conversions requiring new construction. You may also see some language in the notice here about encouraging other best practices, including trying out the National Renewable Energy Laboratory tool and considering different renewable energy options. It's a really fantastic tool that can help you evaluate cost savings with different renewable energy solutions. All of these changes, like the resident engagement ones, will be effective 30 days after publication in the Federal Register notice. Okay, so what this actually means for you, it's pretty simple. It's really just the change for those new construction pieces is that there will be a new required certification as part of the financing plan submission, saying that you are meeting the energy efficiency standards for new construction. Otherwise, there isn't really anything else that's changed here. There is some change, however, on the climate resiliency side. This is a place where we're really trying to encourage owners and public housing authorities to think seriously about what are some of the long-term climate risks that might be facing your property. So here we've got really sort of a 3-step process that we were requiring converting properties to undertake. The first thing you will be required to do is to go to FEMA's National Risk Index, which has data on census tracts throughout the country and identifies specific climate hazards by census tract. So we'd ask you to identify any hazards that are deemed by FEMA to be relatively high or very high based on the location of the property. So you're understanding what sort of climate risks might exist or may exist in the future. Next, we are expecting that you will incorporate into the scope of work a mitigation of those risks or some sort of a plan for those hazards. So you'll have to provide a description of how your proposed scope of work addresses these risks that have been identified for your area. Finally, there's also a requirement to create a property-wide disaster plan, which would include an evacuation plan for the property. We are in the process of working on a template for the disaster plan that should be ready by the time that this requirement kicks in, which again is 30 days after the Federal Register notice. So there's 3 things here: figuring out what your risks are in your area, incorporating sort of mitigation efforts into the scope of work, and then also thinking about, in the case where a disaster strikes, making sure that you have adequate planning for how residents might be able to evacuate and address the disaster. Okay. So as far as what that translates to on the ground and in the course of the RAD transaction, for the property hazard risk and mitigation, you as a PHA will submit a description of, again, how your scope of work addresses the hazards. That'll be part of the conversion overview. That's a conversion overview narrative that's submitted with the financing plan. We'll also expect to see mitigation measures in your capital needs assessment e-tool, or sort of the foundation for developing the scope of work for the RAD conversion. And we'll have our transaction managers will be reviewing that information. For the disaster plan, HUD will not actually be reviewing the disaster plan, so you won't be required to submit it, but you will be required to certify that you have one, and you wouldn't be able to close without that certification. And again, we are planning on providing a template on what that looks like. We'll be doing a lot of great work through the Green Resilient Retrofit program, thinking about climate resiliency. So we're going to be drawing from some of the lessons learned, the development of that program as well. Okay, so that's the climate pieces. There's one more item related to sort of climate resiliency and disaster planning, which is flood prevention. So this is a requirement for new construction and gut rehab. And it's a requirement that the property elevate no less than the greater of the 500-year floodplain or 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain. This also applies to interior non-residential spaces, common areas, lobbies, et cetera. They have to be at minimum flood-proofed at least 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain. Again, this is just for new construction and gut rehab, where it is sort of physically, financially feasible. We know that this is an expensive undertaking. I want to make clear this isn't just a RAD-specific rule, but it really is a placeholder until a new federal-wide rule comes out. You can see here that the new Federal Flood Risk Management Standard rule will end up applying to all HUD-assisted properties, both PBRA and PBB. So we're just making this change now to align with what we expect will be the final rule. As far as what you would need to submit to sort of meet the flood risks requirements, you need to upload a FEMA flood map and a site survey. And we'd be looking for a signed architect's certificate stating that the new construction meets the notice requirements and addresses the site's flood risk. So we've got the flood map, site survey, and architect's certification are the 3 pieces for the flood risk that are new in this supplemental notice. Just to close out the energy efficiency section, here's just a chart going over what we've already talked about today, the different requirements for you as a PHA or as an owner, or just a PHA, as far as submission requirements for these different pieces. So again, for the energy efficiency building standards, certification in your conversion overview narrative is the only thing that's required. For the property hazards and mitigation, we'll need to see a description of the hazards and how they're being addressed in the scope of work, again, as part of the financing plan, and see those mitigation efforts in the CNA tool. For the disaster plan, it's just a certification, part of the consolidated closing cert. And then for the floods, it is the flood map, site survey, signed architect's certificate. Okay, let us pause there, and I will take a look and see if we have any questions. Okay. So for Jeff, for projects that are already designed and in for permits or have received permits with HUD, application submitted but have not started construction, is it correct that we won't have to redesign projects to meet the new higher design standards? I think Stacy, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I had dropped a comment in the chat. So it depends on whether or not the project has submitted a complete financing plan. So if 30 days after the publication of the Federal Register notice, if at that time a project has not yet submitted their complete financing plan, the new higher standards will apply. So for any projects with a financing plan in before 30 days after the Federal Register notice publication, they don't have to redo their plans.
Great, thanks, Stacy. And I see a question there from Alexander. Will paper conversions require disaster plans, et cetera? Yes, that isn't tied to the level of construction. That is for all RAD conversions, you'd be required to undertake that effort. Next question was the length of how long a CNA is good for when applying for that conversion. And Stacy, well, maybe you can remind me, is it still the 12 months?
I don't remember offhand, Will.
I don't remember offhand either. We'll get that answered.
We'll get back to
you before the end of the session.
Yeah. Peter asks, do you know how or if the federal flood risk rule will apply to Section 9 public housing? That is a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm gonna have to check with the final regulations and how that's implemented. But again, this is just for converting properties, at least for the time being. And then Caitlin has a question about the mitigation methods in the e-tool. Is documentation meant to be, these items are to be listed as repair items? And that may need to follow up and provide some additional guidance on how exactly those will show up in the CNA e-tool. Unless Will or Stacy, you happen to know immediately how we'd want those entered in the e-tool. Okay. Yeah, we'll make note of that question, Caitlin. We'll make sure we follow up.
And we've gotten confirmation indeed that Ashwin's correct. The CNA tool is good for 12 months.
Okay.
Before it needs to be updated. Thank you, Ashwin.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Okay. That is it for me. I'm now going to turn it over to Will to give my vocal cords a little bit of a rest and pass over to him to present on Zero HAP residents.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashwin. And if you wouldn't mind proceeding to the next slide. So this issue of Zero HAP residents, what are we even referring to? So as folks are probably well aware, oftentimes the public housing, the RAD contract rents for properties converting from public housing are often below market rents. And sometimes that means that a family paying 30% of their income that's actually greater than the gross rent in the contract. And so Zero HAP is paid. And that creates some issues. Sometimes, and this is an important thing for PHAs to pay attention to, both if they're approaching a conversion or this is one of the provisions that affects folks who've already converted and have been looking for some fixes to this. So what are the issues that are coming up? Well, first, under the current RAD notice, or prior to the supplemental, tenants were required to pay 30% of their income without a cap. Which can be significantly more than what another Section 8 resident would pay outside of RAD. The other issue is that under standard project-based rental assistance and project-based voucher rules, only families that would with incomes where there would be at least $1 of HAP payment can be admitted. A little bit of an arcane rule, but therefore you could have situations where a family might be very low income, might be eligible for the program, but because of the RAD rents and where they are relative to market, the family could not be admitted because their income is just high enough to not require any HAP payments. These are the two issues we're trying to address here. The changes that I'm about to describe are going to be effective 10 days after publication of a Federal Register notice, which, as Stacy's reminded in the chat, should be in the next 1 to 2 weeks. 10 days after that, these changes are effective. Okay, next slide as we walk through each of these. So again, just to show what this looks like, previously on the left side, you see residents are required to pay 30% of their income. So a family whose income was $30,000 a year, where their total tenant payment or TTP was $750, would pay the $750, even though the RAD gross rent was $650. In the normal Section 8 context, that resident would pay $650. And the other issue is only admit residents where at least $1 of HAP would be paid. So let's take that same scenario, and looking at the very low income limit for some geography, it's $35,000. That resident, while eligible for admission into HUD-assisted housing, could not be admitted into the property because their TTP is higher than the gross rent. Okay, so let's talk about what we're doing to fix this. So we're instituting a rent cap, what we're calling a zero HAP rent cap, where where residents do pay 30% of their income, but not to exceed the zero HAP rent cap, which for project-based vouchers is 110% of the FMR less the utility allowance. For PBRA, it's 100% of the FMR less the utility allowance. Or if there's a maximum allowed under the maximum allowed under the tax credit or home rent restrictions, if those funds are present at the property. And then for residents that are paying that rent cap under PBRA, the unit would remain under contract because the PBRA program has a long-standing tradition of always keeping units on the contract, even when there's no HAP paid. In the project-based voucher program, which is a little bit of a different framework, the unit would be removed from the contract after 180 days of the resident paying the zero HAP rent. That doesn't mean it's 180 days of there being zero HAP, but of 180 days where the resident is paying this capped amount. The unit can be reinstated or substituted when the family leaves, or if the family remains and their income subsequently decreases, the PHA is required to readmit the family. Okay, next slide. Importantly, this applies to properties post-conversion. So we've created this transition period that for families that are currently paying more than the zero HAP rent a rent cap today. The PHA and owner must inform the family by notice of the amount of the new alternative rent to be paid and the date that the change will go into effect, which can be no longer than 90 days after the Federal Register notice. Knowing that there's going to be some transition time of updating tenant certifications and tenant files, we've provided this transition time, but expect that it's all going to be done, that rents will be reduced for such residents within 3 months. Okay, next slide. So the next problem that I said we were solving is the admission of zero-HAP families. For PBRA properties, it's a pretty simple requirement. Owners can admit any income qualified household, even if their TTP, their total tenant payment, is greater than the gross rent, and even though there will be zero-HAP. So the requirement that there be at least $1 of HAP simply doesn't apply in these cases. For project-based vouchers, the PHAs can get to the same outcome, but they have to receive a waiver either at the time of conversion or after conversion, and we've spelled out how to get that waiver. The two-bedroom rent, the two-bedroom RAD rent, would have to be below an affordable rent at 40% of AMI, which is, more precisely, the midpoint between the extremely low income and very low income limits. So to look at the PBRA example on the right side, we've got a very low income limit of $35,000 a year. This family's adjusted family income is $30,000. Their TTP would be $750. And even though the RAD gross rent is $700, that family can be admitted because they're still income qualified. They're under the very low income limit. Next slide, please. So for project-based vouchers, where it's not just as of right, you have to request a waiver. For properties that haven't yet converted, we are looking at the rents as folks apply for RAD through the resource desk to let folks know that they maybe should consider applying for this. And they would if they request it, there would be a special provision eventually in the RAD conversion commitment approving the waiver to admit zero-HAP residents for the term of the contract. Again, no waiver is necessary for PBRA. For properties that have already closed and are under a project-based RAD, project-based voucher contracts and wish to receive a waiver, they must submit a waiver through the standard PIH waiver process, which is described in PIH 2018-16, and it's sent through the field office. And again, no waiver is needed for post-conversion PBRA properties. It just applies automatically. Here's an example in King County, Washington, of this math of what you need to show to be eligible for the waiver. It's simple, straightforward math, or as simple as it doesn't require narrative anyway, even if it's not necessarily simple math. But just looking at the very low income and extremely low income limits for this jurisdiction, the midpoint between those amounts is 1,369, and looking up at a RAD rent for a property in King County of 882, this property would be eligible because their RAD rent is below the midpoint between extremely low income and very low income rent limits in King County. Okay, before we get to move on to the duller topics, well, let's see if there's any questions on zero-HAP residents. So I see one question for tax credit conversions. There should be no change to the treatment of zero-HAP families. Is that correct? And that's true that we had an exception in the prior RAD notice where properties that had a tax credit maximum rent restriction, PHAs could already use that amount as the maximum rent. Let's see if there are other questions that haven't already been addressed. Question, for PVV, is a waiver needed every time a zero HAP family applies, or is it just the first time a zero HAP family applies? Thank you very much for the question. It's a waiver for the full term of the initial contract. So if you get the waiver prior to conversion, the waiver will be baked into the RAD conversion commitment and will apply for the term of the HAP contract so you could admit zero HAP families that are income qualified. And if the waiver is requested after conversion, but not through the Office of Recapitalization, rather through the Office of Public and Indian Housing, it would also apply for the remainder of the term of the contract. So it wouldn't just be, it doesn't need to be requested resident by resident, which should help a lot. Sasha says, there's an existing waiver process, but it's hard to meet those requirements. Will the future waivers just need to show the RAD rent is below the midpoint? Yes, that's one of the advantages here. While the math is a little, a little hard to talk through, it's at least fairly straightforward math and doesn't require narrative explanation of how it's a hardship on the community or other descriptions. It's simply available based on the math. We have a question from an MTW agency. If you're planning to supplement the RAD rents, do you look at the original RAD rents or the supplemented or the augmented RAD rents? Answer is you'd look at the augmented RAD rents. Presumably, the closer the rents get to a market rent, the less likely such a waiver is going to be, it would be needed, or such a provision would be needed. If you have an RCC and close to closing, do you ask for the waiver post-closing? We would recommend probably to save you some paperwork to request the waiver now before closing, and we can revise the RCC to make sure that it is included in there now. There's a question about HOTMA over income provisions and their applicability to RAD properties. Let me punt on that and say that's a little bit of a complicated topic. It might end up having a straightforward answer, but we're going to issue separate instructions there on as the HOTMA over income. The HOTMA imposed over-income requirements on specifically to public housing properties. So there's a question of how families who are currently over-income in the public housing program are treated as the properties convert through RAD. It's not an issue now because the over-income requirements or the over-income provisions haven't yet phased in, but we'll provide guidance on that well before the phasing occurs. Thanks, Lauren. And a very important question from Diraj. Any approvals for admitting are approvals for admitting zero HAP families only for new admissions and not for returning tenants? That is correct. Returning tenants cannot be rescreened for any reason whatsoever. So a waiver or this approval from HUD for project-based vouchers is only needed for new admissions after the current population of residents. And And there's a question about whether zero HAP residents that are allowed to stay at the property and just pay the market rent. Not quite. The rent would be capped at essentially what we've created a proxy for the market rent, which is the zero HAP rent cap, which is either roughly 110% of FMR for project-based vouchers, or 100% for project-based rental of FMR for project-based rental assistance. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. And again, of course, if we can come back to questions on zero HAP families later, but I want to make sure we get through the other items. Okay, so the RAD supplemental notice makes some really important changes to the fair cloth to RAD process. And so let's dive into them. Ashwin, let's go to the next slide. So just as a reminder, what is fair cloth to RAD? This is a process we implemented a couple of springs ago where we provide underwriting certainty to overcome barriers to the development of new deeply rent-assisted units. There's over 250,000 public housing units that PHAs are authorized to recreate under what's called the Fair Cloth Amendment. But the biggest barriers to developing them is the ability to underwrite to public housing, the public housing subsidies. So what we do in Fair Cloth to RAD is we provide early commitments that a RAD conversion will take place once the units are built and in the public housing program, such that the property is within the public housing program for a very short period of time. The changes that we're going to walk through are going to be effective immediately once the Federal Register notice is published. And let's dive into those. So first is one on eligibility. Because RAD only permits the conversion of existing public housing units, and that's how RAD was originally created. There were provisions in the RAD notice that said to reserve authority under RAD, you had to have a public housing unit to convert. And therefore, when we introduced Fair Cloth to RAD, the only way a PHA could reserve their authority to convert those units eventually once built is by putting them into a portfolio award. This was a little bit of a workaround to notice drafting. Setting aside history, what the supplemental notice does is simply allows a PHA to reserve authority under our cap, under our RAD cap, which we're currently capped at 455,000 units. A PHA can apply for Fair Cloth to RAD without a portfolio award, and that reserves their authority to eventually convert if they're able to meet all the other requirements. Just to also note that this isn't directly in the notice, but we've issued an FAQ around the same time related to eligibility, that there are some PHAs that have repositioned all of their public housing units under a repositioning tool that requires the PHA to eventually close out its public housing program, such as streamlined voluntary conversion and small PHA, RAD, Section 18 blends, Section 1850 and under, the Section 1850 and under justification, where HUD's clarified that PHAs may develop those Fair Cloth to RAD, their Fair Cloth to RAD units prior to closing out their public housing program, even if they've used one of these tools. So just an important note that in case some haven't seen that FAQ. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. One of the other, this was Ashwin alluded to this earlier. One of the other changes we've made here is around resident notification and engagement. As we developed the Fair Cloth to RAD process, because it was really merging two processes together, we didn't create any new policy. We just kind of got a little creative in how we worked two processes at the same time. We hadn't adjusted for kind of proper resident notification during the Faircloth to RAD process. So the RAD supplemental notice addresses this. It basically creates two kinds of properties. One, if it's an existing property that's occupied, when the PHA requests a NAR, and the notice of anticipated RAD rents, which is very similar to applying for RAD for an existing public housing property, then the standard RAD meetings and notices apply, and we provide kind of the corollaries to all of the milestones by which meetings and notices have to be sent. We don't see this a lot, but it is addressed for when it will inevitably come up. But more common, we see situations where the properties are built, and there's possibly a few months between when it's constructed and when the RAD conversion occurs, and the PHA moves residents into the property. And because they're moving residents into the property at the time or as public housing, we've described what notification requirements and engagement occur with those residents up through the RAD closing. And then the last one, and this is a big one, is around rent augmentation. So under the old notice in Faircloth to RAD, only MTW agencies are able to use to augment the RAD rents. They're able to do this in any kind of RAD conversion, and so that applied in Faircloth to RAD. In the RAD supplemental notice, we don't make any changes to how MTWs can augment their rents. They can still do so. But we've allowed non-MTW PHAs with HAP reserves to augment their Faircloth to RAD rents for PBV conversions if certain conditions are met. And we'll talk about that. But we also allow Faircloth to RAD projects converting to PBRA to use other RAD rent flexibilities, such as the Opportunity Zone Rent Boost, where the property can get up to $100 per unit per month a rent increase if it's in an Opportunity Zone and it's new construction or substantial rehab. Okay, let's talk more through the augmentation. This is a key piece. So just a very basic graphic here. Let's say the Faircloth to RAD rents normally for a property that requested a notice of anticipated RAD rents or a NAR was $668. A PHA that met conditions that I'll walk through in coming slides could use available voucher reserves to set a higher contract rent up to the standard PBV rent caps. So let's just say 110% of FMR if that's what the PHA is established in its admin plan. And now, with this rent of $1,000 and $1,056, the PHA has the property has a lot more juice with which to support financing to actually get the property built in the first place. So we're optimistic that this provision will help to get more of these Faircloth to RAD conversions through and get them unstuck where they'd gotten stuck before. Just to give a sense of, well, why would a PHA do this, right? Why would a PHA commit its voucher reserves to augment the RAD rents, and then that's going to be a forever now commitment that HUD's going to provide the PHA $350, but the PHA is going to need to chip in from its reserves, which will get renewed in future years, $388. Well, one way to look at this is the alternative to the PHA is to just create a new project-based voucher contract. And if they're doing that, they're funding the full HAP subsidy from their voucher reserves. So all $738 per unit per month of subsidy would need to come from their voucher reserves. And it's a kind of net zero proposition. They're taking one voucher out of another purpose, presumably a tenant-based voucher, and project basing it. Whereas if they augment the RAD rents through fair cloth to RAD, in this case, it's almost a 2-for-1. That for every one a voucher that they stop releasing as tenant-based assistance, when it becomes available in their reserves, they could essentially create 2 new units because HUD's providing some of the subsidy for that new unit, and they're reapplying those voucher reserve funds to fill in the gap. So we expect this to be really attractive for a lot of PHAs and hopefully spur some new affordable housing development. So now, very importantly, who's able to augment their fair cloth to RAD rents? We've defined in the RAD supplemental notice that the 2 conditions need to be met. One, the fair cloth to RAD units could not make up more than the greater of 25 units or 25% of units in the project, or 25 units or 40% of the units in the project if it's in a census tract where the poverty rate is no greater than 20%. Or the units are made exclusively available to people who are elderly, eligible for supportive services, or youth receiving Housing Choice Voucher FUP, Family Unification Program assistance. So that's one prong that needs to be satisfied for any given property. The second is more about the market. The property has to be in one of the following locations: either MSA, micro SA, metropolitan statistical area, micropolitan statistical area, or a zip code where the rental vacancy rate is less than 4%, or a zip code where 90% of the small area FMR is more than 110% of the metropolitan area FMR. So in other words, this is roughly getting at where vouchers are hard to use because vacancy rates are low, or because the market is heated beyond the FMRs. So this means that not every property will be eligible for it. We are working to make this data more readily available to PHAs to be able to look up whether a proposed site would meet the second prong. Obviously, the first prong is within the PHA and their partners' control in terms of how they're designing the property. But for the second prong, the data, much of the data is going to be pulled from census data or American Community Surveys data in order to be able to assess this. To request the augmented rents, PHAs, just as usual, are going to submit a notice of request for a notice of anticipated RAD rents, the NAR, through the RAD resource desk by selecting the fair cloth conversion option and providing the specific information we need as usual to come up with the NARs to figure out what public housing subsidy the HUD would provide for the new unit. Any rent augmentation the PHA intends to make can be applied to the rents reflected in the NAR. And it can request how much it wishes to adjust the RAD rents through that process. Okay, next slide. Oh, and this is, oh, good. I forgot we had more on resident engagement here. So if tenants are admitted to the property, this is just coming back to the resident engagement piece. If tenants are admitted to the property after the issuance of the RCC and prior to closing the RAD conversion, so what that means is after the units have been built under public housing, but then there's a lag between the RAD conversion or the construction of the property and when the conversion occurs. then the PHA is to provide the written notification in the form of our RAD information notice to all residents, to provide written explanation of leasing and occupancy changes that will occur after move-in that result from the RAD conversion. Of course, there won't be any relocation at that point because the property will have just undergone construction or its rehab. So it's really more about understanding the leasing and occupancy changes. And then a meeting with each resident household to discuss the conversion, explain written materials, and provide residents an opportunity to ask questions. So that those meetings could happen during lease up itself, or could happen through other venues. Okay, and that's it on fair cost to RAD. I'm sure there are a few questions from the audience. Let's see if folks, other folks from HUD can help to identify any things that were asked that we did not get to in the chat or that we want to be helpful to re-emphasize.
I'll just make a comment that we're also going to be doing a Fair Cloth to RAD specific webinar next month. So stay tuned for registration for that webinar. Let's see, I answered a few questions in the chat, but checking.
So one question is, well, how much does the PHA need to commit in their reserves to augment the RAD rent? So the way it works really is they're committing funds for the initial year of the HAP contract and making sure those funds are available. And once the PHA spends reserve funds, just like if they spend reserve funds on any other purpose, issuing more tenant-based vouchers or whatever eligible purposes that there are for those reserve funds, they get renewed in their next year's baseline. So HUD provides the funding to the PHA. So it's really just that first year that the PHA pays for from reserves. This and specifically, just to say from the non-NTW perspective. Are there other things folks are seeing?
So Jeff's question about the notice requirements for Fair Cloth to RAD after RCC. So if residents are moving in after issuance of RCC, but prior to the RAD conversion closing, then they will be required to have resident meetings and issue the written. So that assumes you're occupying between RCC issuance and closing, but if you don't occupy the units, a lot of times we anticipate the closing will happen quickly after RCC issuance, and then you would not have to do the resident meeting requirements.
Just because I see a little confusion about the maybe it's not confusion, but around the comment I made earlier on PHAs that have used we call it a tool that requires you to close out, a repositioning tool that requires you to close out afterwards. So just to provide a little nuance, closing out of public housing does not just mean converting or repositioning all of your units. There's other steps a PHA has to take to actually wind down its program itself and terminate its ACC, which very, very, very few agencies have. I think over 200 or 300 agencies have repositioned all of their public housing units in the last 10 years or so, but only a handful have actually closed out their public housing programs. So most still have these dormant public housing programs that where they might still have fair cloth authority that can be activated. So a question about the timing of the actual conversion. So indeed, the property gets built, it's put online as public housing, and then PHAs usually strive to convert the property as soon thereafter as possible. legally could be the next day. But because there's RAD closing requirements that still need to be met, sometimes it takes PHAs longer. Doesn't need to, because a PHA could create its closing package well before that stage, and even have that submitted to HUD. But still, sometimes it takes PHAs longer, and they can't hold back from leasing up the property in order to meet tax credit or other requirements. So it's those situations where we anticipate folks will sometimes first come lease the property as a public housing resident before the RAD conversion occurs. But it's certainly not required to happen that way. The PHA could make sure the RAD conversion occurs quickly enough before leasing.
Well, I just want to be mindful of time. We've got about 30 minutes left and still a lot to cover. So
great. All right, let's keep rolling. Housing quality standards. Let's go to the next slide, Ashwin. Thanks, Stacy, for the time reminder. So back under the old notice in standing guidance, non-RAD project-based voucher units in a property with RAD units still had to pass HQS inspections before the HAB contract could be entered into, even though the RAD units were exempt from HQS inspections. So one of the problems we're going to resolve is this caused difficulties when units were expected to undergo substantial rehab. So you'd have properties that were going to be that needed the HAB contract to support the financing, but the property was going to be rehabbed, and oftentimes with the residents able to remain in place or staged rehab in different parts of the building, and the owner was required to, for example, address HQS deficiencies, but only to then turn around and do a more comprehensive rehabilitation of the property. So let's get into what the notice does. Next slide. So first, with respect to inspections, it retains the RAD alternative requirements that when work is occurring under RAD, all units must undergo inspection for HQS no later than the date of the completion of the work, as indicated in the RCC. And very importantly, it extends this provision to the non-RAD PBB units replacing public housing units of the project. Of course, this is what are commonly known as the RAD Section 18 blends, when non-RAD PBB units are replacing public housing units of the project. The other thing is it says that the supplemental notice says that before units can be placed on the HAB contract and assistance can be paid on behalf of a household, instead of an inspection, but to make sure that there are no life-threatening conditions, if residents are going to remain at the property, the PHA can rely on an owner certification that they have no reasonable basis to have knowledge that life-threatening conditions exist. So, of course, these are existing properties within subject to regular inspections, and so PHAs and owners are very familiar with these properties and should be able to make these attestations effectively. Go to the next slide. Is about housing quality standard applicability during the period of work. So the notice clarifies that housing quality standard requirements still do apply to the period of work per the HAB contract that we use in order for assistance to be paid on behalf of a household. So again, this is meant to provide a baseline of protections for decent, safe, and sanitary standards if residents are going to be at the site while rehab is happening, possibly in other parts of the site. The PHA is required to conduct inspections when needed. So, for example, in response to tenant complaints, and enforce that aspect of the HAB contract that says the HQS still applies, even though there's no mandatory inspection beforehand. And owners are still required to correct any identified deficiencies within the timeframe specified in the HAB contract. So for any life-threatening deficiencies that are found, that the deficiency needs to be corrected within 24 hours. And for non-life-threatening deficiencies, the deficiency needs to be corrected within 30 days, or it could be a longer time as agreed to by the PHA. So, for example, in some cases, the PHA might determine a deficiency because it will be addressed in the scope of work that being conducted by the general contractor, to delay the correction of that deficiency up until the completion of their work. So both of these changes that I talked in the last two slides will be effective 10 days after the Federal Register notice is published, which again should be in the next week or two. Next slide. So what does this mean? We expect this to ease administrative requirements for RAD Section 18 blends, eliminate unnecessary work orders, and increase protections for residents in place, because PHAs will be able to add units without life-threatening deficiencies to the non-RAD PBB HAB contract and receive HAB payments for those occupied units. And PHAs may need to inspect units during rehab to ensure safe conditions for residents in place. So as soon as a resident says, wait a second, I'm living in conditions that I don't suspect are safe, the PHA would be required to perform an inspection and require correction of deficiencies. Is there another slide on this? Okay, that's the end of that. That was a meaty one. So let's look at see what folks have on questions. If other folks have identified questions that we should start with, let's go.
Yeah, well, there's one from Richard, just clarifying we would still follow HQS, or how that might interact with the Inspire standards.
So my understanding is that wherever Inspire leads, or if it is already led there, it's still called HQS, as that's the statutory standard under the project-based voucher program. So while the HQS standards are revised by Inspire, they're still called HQS.
Great. And then there's a question from Kathy. Can you clarify if HQS applies during the period of work in order for assistance to be paid on behalf of a household, in addition to correcting any identified deficiency? Is there a need for an HQS inspection in order to provide subsidy, or can the PHA rely on the certification in the absence of a deficiency being otherwise identified?
The PHA can provide subsidy or relying on the certification that there's no life-threatening deficiencies. It does not need to perform an inspection in order to provide subsidy.
I think that is the last question there.
Sarah, was there anything else that I missed or that should be pointed out as well? If you're still on.
Yep, I'm still here. No, I think that's it. I was going to pop on to answer Kathy's question, but you answered it exactly as I would have. So.
Okay, so next thing is the notice includes a few provisions that improve the efficacy of RAD Section 18 blends. So just as basic background, PHAs increasingly combine the use of RAD and Section 18 disposition authority in RAD transactions. We call this blends. Blends allow tenant protection vouchers that are issued after a Section 18 approval to be when they're project-based, to be combined with at the same property with the RAD rents, which is particularly beneficial when the RAD rents are below normal project-based voucher rents. And this increases property revenue, which allows for greater financing and greater financial strength of the property. We've got a standardized and streamlined blend structure for PHAs that perform a certain threshold of rehab. We call those the construction blends, or that are small PHAs for PHAs that are under 250 units or less. We also know that PHAs informally create blends. Most of the provisions that we've created around RAD Section 18 blends, such as resident protection, the uniform resident protections, importantly, apply even when PHAs create these informal blends. They do this by first getting approval, Section 18 approval for a property, but then converting a portion of those units instead through RAD. Oftentimes in order to make sure the resident protections are there. Next slide. So what have we done in supplemental notice? First, for the construction blends, we had a high cost area definition, which allowed for the most generous blends, 20% RAD and 80% Section 18 for certain high cost markets. But the supplemental notice creates an additional definition or an alternative definition to high cost areas for properties where the construction costs exceed 200% of the national average of HUD's published housing construction costs, which currently we're still using 2022 numbers. And that number is $304,653 per unit. So wherever a property rehab or construction costs exceed that amount, which unfortunately we're seeing is more often, they would qualify under the high cost area construction blend. Second, for the RAD Section 18 small PHA blend, the notice provides criteria for local field offices to approve PHAs with a voucher program size under 250. Prior RAD notice had said you have to have 250, you have to have less than 250 public housing units, but more than 250 vouchers, which very few PHAs actually qualified for. So the RAD supplemental notice provides more of a clearer exception process for PHAs to work with field offices to get approval to go ahead, even if their voucher program is under 250 units. Then lastly, the RAD supplemental notice takes care of a couple of smaller issues, exempting non-RAD PBVs that are within a blend from the PBV program cap and PBV owner selection provisions in certain scenarios where they had not been previously exempt. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. All these changes will be effective once the Federal Register notice is published. Okay, let's dive in deeper. So I talked about this high cost area where provision for the construction blends where previously we've designated certain markets, those where the housing construction costs for the locality exceeded 120% of the national average based on our RS means data. It seemed to miss a number of properties and markets where housing construction costs are unfortunately still really high. So we've created this additional definition that I described where any project where the hard construction cost exceeds 200% of the national average is also eligible for the high cost area 80% Section 18, 20% RAD blend. We've already posted a new RAD Section 18 blend and opportunity zone workbook on the resource desk where folks can look up, can test and show that their property qualifies under the high cost area definition. Okay, under the small PHA blend, The notice creates an approval process for PHAs to be able to, small PHAs under 250 units or 250 units or less, to qualify for the small PHA blend by demonstrating or by getting field office approval. The PHA submits their request through the RAD resource desk through our concept call checklist, which we route then to the field office for approval. And the field office will be looking at the PHA CMAP scores, any housing choice voucher program related audit findings, making sure their admin plans up to date, and checking to see if the PHA's got enough voucher authority to keep serving families off of the tenant-based waiting list and providing choice mobility options for project-based voucher residents. Next slide. So these are the two nuanced items. Previously, RAD units and non-RAD PBV units replacing public housing units on site had always been exempt from, or have been for a few years, been exempt from the percentage limitation applicable to the PBV program. Generally 20% of the PHA's voucher program can be project-based, sometimes up to 30% in certain exceptions. But RAD units and some non-RAD PBV units had always just been exempt from that limitation. RAD project-based voucher units where the assistance going to a new site have also been exempt, but what had not been exempt is if a PHA is doing a blend and it's a transfer of assistance to a new site, because that's a new site, the non-RAD PBV units were not exempt from the cap. So the RAD supplemental notice now exempts those units from the cap. So the takeaway, if you aren't following, was all units preserved through RAD or through a RAD Section 18 blend do not count against a PHA's project-based voucher cap, whether it's on-site or off-site through a transfer of assistance. Next slide. The other item here is on owner selection procedures. So again, RAD units have always been exempt from competitive selection. Non-RAD PBV units that replace public housing where the PHA administering the contract has an ownership interest, or since HOTMA, have also been exempt from competitive selection. But what we missed were situations where a PHA didn't have a voucher program, so was partnering with another PHA that would administer the project-based voucher contract. But because that PHA doesn't have an ownership stake in the actual property, it wasn't exempt from competitive selection, which was essentially a loop in the law. So in the supplemental notice, we exempt such scenarios from competitive selection. So PHAs without a voucher program that need to partner with another PHA to administer the vouchers don't also need to go through a competitive selection process in order for that PHA to then project base at the original site. So again, the simple takeaway here is all units preserved through RAD or RAD Section 18 blends are not subject to project-based voucher competitive selection requirements. Okay. Before we go, I think to our last topic, any questions on RAD and Section 18 blends that we should cover? Or should we, you know what, I think let's go through the remaining slides and then see if there are any questions there at the end for their last few minutes. So the last thing we did in RAD, and this goes across all RAD conversion types, so public housing, mod rehab, all the PRAC conversions, is requires all properties going through RAD to undertake radon testing. Previously, there had been some exemptions, but it turns out that the exemptions were based on the level of work a property was undertaking. But radon is one of those items that it doesn't depend on its presence, and its harm doesn't depend on whether you're disturbing the ground. It's there or it's not. And so we realized those exemptions, which had been borrowed from FHA, were kind of misleading. So in this RAD supplemental notice, the clean takeaway is that all properties are required to provide a radon report through either the Part 50 environmental review, or if it's a project-based voucher property or conversion, and it's then they're submitting the owner or housing authority is submitting just a radon report directly to us for our review. And these provisions are going to be effective for any conversion or transaction plans submitted 14 days after the publication of the Federal Register notice. Next stage. Okay, I think we covered this basically for property or conversion subject to a Part 50 review. All those radon reports will go through HEROES and be submitted as part of the environmental review process. For Part 58, because oftentimes radon is not covered in Part 58 reviews, the radon report's a separate submission to us in the transaction or conversion plan. Okay, next slide. All right, let's quickly review this. I won't walk through all this, but folks will have it in case they need. On the next slide, we just kind of review again the effective dates for each of the provisions, but I will not walk through that because it's probably more helpful to go through any questions. Is there any last slide we have, Ashwin? Questions? Perfect. All right, where should we go? One question, does the radon policy apply to PRAC conversions? Yes, it does. How do you determine, this is going back a few topics, but how do you determine if you're eligible for a zero HAP waiver? If it's a PBRA property, there's no need to request a waiver, but if it's a project-based voucher property, you'd look at the rent a resident at the very low income limit, the 50% of AMI level, and the extremely low income limit, the 30% of AMI level are, and it's the midpoint between those two. And if that level is for a 4-bedroom unit, if that level is greater than the 2-bedroom RAD rent, then the property is eligible for the zero HAP waiver. Or we have a question about I think this is about the PRAC rent increases. The question is, do previously approved OCAF amounts count against the $250 per unit per month increase that's permitted? And the same could be true for, other PRAC properties might also have gotten a budget-based rent adjustment prior to conversion. That often happens. But I think, I see. I think this question is with respect to a to be developed capital advance property. The $250 is based on need. So we will very shortly be publishing the criteria that we would be using to assess whether a property needs $250 per unit per month increase. It's not an automatic increase just because the property is doing new construction. If the property is already flush with sources, as I'm sure few are, but then it would not be able to demonstrate need. But the net increase to the RAD rents would be assessed based on determining that the property needs the amount. Question, do the radon requirements apply to formerly converted properties? No, these requirements only apply to properties that are submitting a transaction plan or conversion plan 14 days after the publication of the Federal Register notice. So that is it definitely doesn't apply to folks that had previously converted. Are folks seeing other questions we should get to? I see some questions on radon that I suspect we may not have the right staff on the call here to get to, but we can bring those back to us and make sure those are addressed, unless others see some that have answers that we know.
No, I don't think so. And just to reiterate, Lucy had asked if we would be able to provide responses to the questions posted in the chat, and that's certainly something we can do. We'll take all the questions we got and provide sort of written responses that we can circulate after. I did see one more further up the chain. It was about the program cap and owner selection flexibility. Just a question. It sounds like we've obtained a regulation waiver for the Section 18 program cap and owner selection flexibility. Is that right? Or is this just a change in the way we're interpreting the regulations?
Correct. It's a waiver. It's a new waiver that we've adopted through the RAD notice.
And yes, just to respond to Nicole's question and maybe a question that others have. Yes, this presentation will be made available. We have recorded it, and we'll also have a PDF of the slides that we'll be able to share in the days following the presentation. We can wait just another minute or two if folks are have questions they'd want to put into the chat while we take a look and see if there's any others that we missed.
So I've got some intel. I'm going to read something that I think answers Marissa's question. The radon report must meet the standards of HUD's MAP guide, which applies to FHA financing. Section 9.6.3, and the MAP guide states the radon testing must follow the protocol set forth by the American Association of Radon Scientists and Technologists, protocol for conducting radon and radon decay product measurements in multifamily buildings, commonly known as ANSI ARST MAMF 2017. There we go. It's I see a question about when eligibility for the high cost area is determined. So it's done at the financing plan. It's at that stage where we'll actually confirm eligibility and split the application. Remember, in a RAD Section 18 blend, a PHA comes into RAD for the entire property, and then we later split it off with a piece RAD and a piece Section 18, which we handle internally. We do that splitting at the financing plan submission. So it's at that point that the eligibility is confirmed.
Maybe we can take these, the last two here in the chat. The first one here from Guillermo. How can we get an estimate of the RAD rents for Faircloth RAD project for financial feasibility studies? Guillermo, you'd do that by submitting a request for a notice of anticipated RAD rents. So you'd make that request through the RAD resource desk, and it would require you to submit a little bit of information about comparable property that we might be able to use, and sort of the unit distribution type of property. And that will be able to provide an estimate of those rents. There's no commitment to proceed with a Faircloth to RAD project, so we encourage folks, if you have an interest, you want to understand what that funding would be, to come in to us and request a notice of anticipated RAD rents. And then the other question here, Will, this might be better answered by you, from Lori. For blends, the revision exempts PHAs with an ownership interest from the competitive selection process. But do PHAs still need an independent entity to confirm the PBV rents?
Yes. So unrelated, you might be exempt from competitive selection to put the property under a project-based voucher contract when a PHA has an ownership interest in the property, or if it's in a blend and is offsite. but that doesn't impact the PHA's need to use an independent entity if the PHA has an ownership interest in that property, with the independent entity providing that core task of doing rent determinations and NHQS and things like that. We have a question about the PRAC rent increases. Confirming it's limited by the 120% of FMR cap. Yes, that is correct. But is the bump for utility savings similarly limited? This is kind of fun math, but because the utility savings measure captures in the contract rent what the utility allowance is decreasing by, or a portion of what the utility allowance is decreasing by. And FMRs are a gross rent, that the 120, the contract rent is limited by 120% of FMR minus the utility allowance. So it never actually comes into play as a rent cap. The adjustment that is made to the contract rent is always more than offset by the reduction in the utility allowance.
Great, thank you, Will. And thank you everybody for attending the webinar today and for all the fantastic questions put into the chat. As we mentioned, we're going to make this recording available. We'll have the slides available, and we'll also be following up with a written responses to the questions that were put in the chat. We'll post these things and send them out via email to everybody who's registered. Also post them on HUD.gov/RAD as well as the resource desk. I'll just do a final plug. We're also planning on doing a specific FERCLOF to RAD webinar in September through the Wednesday webinar repositioning series. We'll send more information about that when we have the registration link ready. All right.
Well,
thank you, everybody. Really, really appreciate it.